So in our last lecture on human development, we're going to talk about the developing personality. We've covered the development of the body and of the mind, but we haven't yet talked about how people's personalities or social skills develop. Soon after infants are born, they prefer to look at people's faces compared to just about any other visual information. They also show a marked preference for their mother's face compared to the faces of strangers. This is likely evolutionarily beneficial because parents are a valuable source of information and love and support that infants need to flourish. We do see, though, that stranger anxiety begins about 8 or 9 months and peaks around 12 to 15 months. And this is that really clingy age where babies don't want to be left alone with people they aren't familiar with. So you ever see the infant cry and cling to their mom when babysitter shows up? This is because of that stranger anxiety fear. And it's normal, it's all a normal part of early social development. This trend also appears to be largely identical in virtually all cultures. So this suggests that it's a human trait and is not indicative of any one particular culture or society. And it's likely that this anxiety may actually be an adaptive mechanism for keeping infants away from unknown adults who might do them harm. Babies vary widely in how they interact socially. Ever spend time with babies? Sometimes some babies are super chill and relaxed, nothing phases them. Others are super fussy and cry all the time. Two of my friends recently had babies right around the same time, and one of them has a very easy baby. This kid could sleep through anything, nothing phases him. He is just very, very chill and laid back, definitely an easy baby. Whereas the other one is fussy. If my friend sets her down, the little girl starts to cry. She's very needy, she needs a lot of attention. So that shows a pretty good example of differences in what we call temperament, which are differences in social and emotional styles. Temperament is a basic emotional style. It appears very early on in development. We're not really sure, but it's thought to be largely genetic in origin. So that means that if you were a difficult baby, you're in for a rough ride because you're likely going to have a difficult baby as well. But the fact that it's expected to be genetic makes it largely different from other personality characteristics which appear later and tend to be more environmentally influenced. Not much is known about what influences temperament. There's some evidence that maternal stress levels during pregnancy may play a role. So if mom lives in a stressful environment or goes through a stressful experience, that might influence the temperament of the baby, but we're just not sure yet. Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess identified three major temperament styles in children. There's easy infants who are pretty adaptable and relaxed. They're calm and easy. They don't cry a whole lot in most situations, and this represents about 40% of babies. Then there's difficult or high needs infants. They're fussy, easily frustrated, cry often. It's hard to tell why they're crying and what they want. Fortunately, this only represents about 10% of babies. Then there's slow to warm up infants who can be easily disturbed at first by new stimuli like sounds or new people, but they gradually adjust and calm down over time. And this represents about 15% of babies. You're probably thinking, hey, those numbers don't add up to 100. You'd be right. The other 35% really just don't fit neatly into any one of those categories. I mentioned this earlier, temperament is pretty stable across childhood. So if you have a difficult baby, unfortunately, that's probably not going to change much. However, there's still hope. Parents can work to change their child's temperament by how they interact with them. So although it's a bit easier on everyone if the baby's just easy to begin with, if you have a very sensitive parent who's warm and adaptive to the child's needs, these types of temperament styles don't really cause too much of a problem in terms of long-term development. It's mostly just about the day-to-day functioning. Jerome Keegan later identified another temperament style called behavioral inhibition. This is a personality style or temperament that relates to the tendency to feel distress or fear and to withdraw when faced with novel environments, situations, or people. Children showing behavioral inhibition tend to be afraid, anxious, or uncomfortable in unfamiliar situations and tend to stop playing and withdraw when they're around unfamiliar people. These children tend to be very vigilant of their surroundings during these unfamiliar situations. They don't really approach new people, situations, or objects. Keegan estimated that only about 10% of children are behaviorally inhibited, and that this trait may not be stable over time. So in other words, some studies have shown that as children grow older, they may learn to respond in more varied ways in response to new situations. On the other hand, some of the children who showed behavioral inhibition early on tend to continue to show these tendencies throughout childhood. So, in other words, there's a subset of children who show stable behavioral inhibition throughout childhood, whereas other children show much more variability in behavior inhibition and don't show these tendencies later in childhood. So, this suggests that there's quite a few individual differences which can influence the child's trajectory. Another really important component of early social development is attachment. This is the strong emotional connection we share with those to whom we feel closest, which is usually our parents or other primary caregivers. Almost all infants forge these bonds with adults, and this ensures that infants and children don't stray too far from the people who feed and protect them. So to understand a bit more about attachment, let's first talk about something called imprinting. Now, imprinting was first observed in the 1930s by Konrad Lorenz. He was watching some baby goslings and began to notice that some of them would follow around and attach themselves to any large moving object that they saw in the first few hours after hatching. He discussed this critical period, a specific window in time in which an event must occur. So, if these goslings didn't see a large moving object, such as their mother, during the first 36 hours of their life, they wouldn't imprint on anything, and probably never would. People then began to wonder if this applied to other mammals or even humans. The short answer is that it does, but the window for imprinting in humans is a much bigger. It doesn't end as abruptly for most intelligent mammals. So this is where we get into the differentiation between a critical period and a sensitive period. A critical period means if it doesn't happen in that time window, it's not going to happen. A sensitive period means that you have the best chances of it happening during that time period, but it could still happen outside of there. Language learning is a great example of a sensitive period. We learn language best in early childhood, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn language in other times. So there's a sensitive period in humans for this imprinting. And it does appear that early and prolonged separation from attachment figures produces detrimental effects on psychological adjustment, including things like social bonding. John Bowlby first became interested in attachment while observing young British children who were separated from their families to protect them from the German bombings of London during World War II. He found that children who were separated from their primary caretakers before the age of 5 engaged in much more delinquent and maladaptive behaviors compared to those separated later. Sir Michael Rudder added to this body of research with his work on Romanian orphans. In the 1970s and 80s in Romania, what happened was all forms of birth control were banned. So this resulted, unsurprisingly, in really high birth rates and a lot of parents who simply couldn't support their children. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, there ended up being a really high rate of babies dropped off at orphanages, which quickly became overcrowded and overwhelmed. And they gave up on trying to provide quality care in an effort to provide any care at all. So the unfortunate effects are that children were left alone in their cribs all day and night without any sort of social or emotional bonding. Now, when these children were later adopted, it turned out that those who were adopted before they were 6 months of age fared pretty well. But those adopted after 6 months of age exhibited a number of problems like inattention, hyperactivity, extreme difficulty attaching to their parents and forming bonds. Now, we don't know the direction of this trend. Remember, we always have to think back to that correlation causation issue. It's possible that the infants who were adopted after 6 months were adopted later because they showed difficult tendencies or appeared more aloof, causing parents to choose other children instead of them. But this association between early institutionalization and later psychological problems has been observed in other studies as well. So the moral of the story is, while we don't have a critical imprinting or attachment period, we do have a sensitive period. And it's really important that we learn how to develop bonds during that period, because this sets us up for later social interaction throughout the rest of our lifespan. So as researchers started to learn more about attachment, they begin to notice different attachment styles. Most notably, Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues developed the strange situation task, which is a systematic way of quantifying infants' attachment styles. So in this task, mothers and their 1-year-old children were placed in a new and unfamiliar room filled with toys. A stranger would then come in, as you see in the picture, and then the mother leaves and returns to the room. She does this 2 times, and researchers observe the child's reaction to each departure and return. So let's take a closer look.
In 1969, American psychologist Mary Ainsworth gave developmental psychology a new procedure for studying attachment in infants. She called it the strange situation classification, and it's widely referred to as simply the strange situation. As an adult, you know when you've formed an attachment with someone. You know how it feels, and you know how to express your feelings in words. However, when it comes to babies and young children, they haven't yet developed these skills, and therefore researchers must turn to more subtle techniques, such as the strange situation, which measures the security of an attachment in 1 to 2-year-olds. A 20-minute participatory observation, during which the researcher observes the infant's behavioral responses to a series of scenarios. Ainsworth's strange situation includes 8 stages, each lasting roughly 3 minutes. To start with, the mother, baby, and researcher are all together in the room, a small, neutrally coloured space with some toys for the baby to play with. The experimenter leaves after around a minute, and the mother and baby are alone for approximately 3 minutes. In this stage, researchers are watching to see whether the child is confident to explore the new environment, or whether she stays close to the mother. A stranger joins the mother and baby in the room. The researchers record the baby's response to this unfamiliar newcomer, who is left alone with the baby when the mother leaves the room. At this stage, the researchers are observing the baby's behavior for signs of separation anxiety. 3 minutes later, the mother returns, and the researchers observe for the baby's reunion response. The stranger leaves the room. A few minutes more, and the mother leaves the room too, leaving the baby alone for the first time in the experiment. The next person to enter the room is the stranger, and finally, after 3 minutes, the mother returns and the stranger leaves. All in all, a perfectly strange situation for all involved. So, what were the researchers measuring? When the mother was in the room with the baby, they scored the infant's behavior on 4 measures: proximity and contact seeking, contact maintaining, avoidance of proximity and contact, and resistance to contact and comforting. The baby's exploratory behaviors were also recorded as she explored the environment. Ainsworth reported that infants display one of 3 attachment types. Securely attached infants showed...
We'll talk about that next, so we don't need to see that part of the video. From the strange situation tasks, 4 categories of behavior were established. So the first is secure attachment. This is when the infant becomes upset after the mother's departure, but are happy when she returns. They reach out to her for a hug, etc. These babies are using mom as a secure base from which to explore their environment. This accounts for about 60% of infants. Next is insecure avoidant attachment. This is about 15 to 20% of infants, where the child reacts to both the departure and the return with complete indifference. So they don't seem really to notice or care all that much that mom is gone or that mom is back. They may look up and see her leave and come back, but they won't really cry or react, hence the term ambivalent. Insecure anxious attachment is another 15 to 20%. And this is when the infant reacts to the departure with panic and shows mixed emotions upon the mother's return. They might sometimes be happy or reach for the mother, but cry at the same time, sort of going through all the emotions at once. And the last one is disorganized attachment, which is about 5 to 10%. and is a pattern of attachment that just seems sort of all over the place, hence disorganized and confused, right? So the baby's not really showing any sort of clear patterns. This category was added on later. Originally, it was just the secure and insecure classifications, but Ainsworth's team later added this last category, and much is still unknown about it. Attachment styles from the strange situation task have been shown to predict children's later behavior. Overall, infants who are securely attached tend to be much better adjusted, more helpful, more empathetic, and overall more successful than those with insecure or disorganized attachment styles early on. Anxious attachment styles tend to have problems with peers later in life. They tend to be rejected or disliked. And children can have different attachment styles with different parents. So they might display a secure attachment with mom, but an insecure or anxious attachment with dad. Moving along now, when considering the child-parent relationship, attachment style is just one piece. Another important component is parenting style, or the way the parent reacts to the child. In the 1970s, Diana Baumrind observed middle-class Caucasian families and concluded that all parenting styles fit into three major categories. So first up is permissive or indulgent. This is when parents are lenient and use very little discipline, but are highly affectionate and involved with their children. One good example of this is Homer and Marge Simpson. They love their kids, but basically let them do whatever they want. Next up is authoritarian, which is when parents are very strict. They inflict a lot of punishment and show little affection or warmth. Authoritarian parents tend to be extremely strict and have high expectations to the point of overachievement. They engage in little dialogue with children about their feelings and aren't really responsive to children's needs. One famous example of authoritarian parenting is Brie Vandekamp from Desperate Housewives, if anybody watches. Authoritative parenting styles are characterized by being supportive but setting clear and firm limits. Authoritative parents are characterized by being child-centered, balanced, having a give-and-take relationship, and this is widely recognized as the most recommended and effective form of parenting. My favorite example of authoritative parenting is Mufasa from The Lion King. He's clearly supportive of Simba and recognizes and validates his feelings, but set clear limits that Simba better maintain. A fourth style was later added on by Maccoby and Martin, which is called uninvolved. So in this parenting style, the parents are uninvolved, detached, dismissive, and neglectful of the child, providing for their basic needs, but really not much more than that. My dad growing up loved Married with Children, so I watched that show quite a bit. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but if anybody watches that show, Peg and Al Bundy were definitely neglectful parents. So as I mentioned, the evidence is pretty clear that children with authoritative, so warm but firm, parents show the best adjustment, while children with uninvolved parents tend to fare the worst. But as always, there are some limitations to note in Baumrind's research. The findings are correlational, so again, we cannot infer causation. We don't know whether permissive parents who are impulsive might pass on impulsive genes that dispose their children to high impulsivity, so a gene by environment interaction. And these findings don't hold up super well in collectivist cultures as opposed to more individualistic cultures like ours. So here's an opportunity for you to earn some extra credit. On the next slide, there's a video. So I want you to watch the video. There's 8 different clips and identify which parenting style goes with each clip. So you can then submit that to the extra credit assignment portal under this week's module on Canvas. And make sure to do that by 11:59 on Sunday evening, which is the same deadline as everything else is due for this module. You must get at least 7 out of 8 correct on the extra credit questions to be able to earn the extra credit, so watch carefully. Here's the video. The PowerPoint is posted in Canvas. You can download it and watch it there. I'm not going to play it here. All right, so let's quickly touch on a few other considerations in parenting. First, I want to talk about the influence of peers versus parents on social development. Beginning as early as elementary school, you start to spend a lot of time interacting with peers in class, at lunch, and after school activities. peers begin to take on a really large role in influencing behavior. Eventually, the influencing role of peers even begins to surpass that of parents in the development of socialization and behaviors. Other research on parenting has also looked at the differences between fathers and mothers on socialization and development. This work finds that fathers are different from mothers in several key ways. Fathers tend to be less attentive and less affectionate. They spend less time with babies, but when they do hang out with them, they spend more of that time engaged in physical play compared to mothers. And parents are preferred as playmates by children, regardless of the children's gender, whereas mom tends to be more of the disciplinarian and the meter of basic needs. These findings drive home the importance of considering parenting roles of mothers and fathers as distinct and unique. Simply saying parent may not account for all of the nuance there. Other research has examined the impact of non-nuclear families on child development. Some research has shown that children from single-parent families may display more behavioral problems than children from two-parent families, but overall, data comparing children from single and two-parent families is correlational. So much other research is needed to really disentangle these relationships. While the impact of single parenthood on children is unclear, the impact of same-sex parenting on development is pretty straightforward. In fact, children raised by same-sex parents do not differ from children raised by opposite-sex parents on a variety of adjustment outcomes, including social outcomes, academic performance, or even the child's own sexual orientation. Unsurprisingly, there's been a lot of research on the effects of divorce in children. Most children come out of divorce without long-term emotional damage. The effects of divorce on the children largely depends on the severity of conflict in the household before the divorce occurred. So how much the parents were fighting, how much the children were exposed to the fighting, how nasty or hostile the parents were to one another, things like that. Interestingly, when there was only mild conflict before the divorce, the effects on children's adjustment tend to be much more severe compared to when there was intense conflict before the divorce. Now, this may sound counterintuitive at first, but if you think about it, when there was intense conflict before the divorce, children may be better able to understand why their parents need to separate, which helps them to adjust better. If the parents were adept at hiding the conflict and the children really only saw some mild problems, they might have a harder time understanding why their parents are separating. The quiz code for this week is cookie. Let's change gears now to talk about the development of gender identity. Gender identity refers to individuals' senses of being male, female, or something in between. It's how we see ourselves in terms of our gender, whatever that may be. Gender concepts are pretty crucial to children's understanding of themselves as social beings. The terminology associated with gender identity can be a little dicey, so let's take a moment to make sure that we're clear. Sex refers to an individual's biological status as male or female. This is as simple as what chromosomes they have and what reproductive organs they were born with. Is there a penis or is there a vagina? Gender is the psychological characteristics associated with being male or female. Now, there can be some struggles with gender identity development. So there might be some biological ambiguity of sex. Some people may be intersex, which means that they're born with both a penis and a vagina. There can also be some psychological feelings of being trapped in the wrong body. So say you were born a biological female, but you feel deep down that you are male and you identify with being male and you are simply born into the wrong body. This is known as being transsexual and often results in the person taking on the identity of the gender they most identify with. Sometimes this involves a surgical or hormonal transition from one sex to the other, but sometimes it just involves the way the individual presents themselves to the world. For example, a biological male who identifies as female might grow their hair out long, wear dresses and makeup and high heels, and go by a female name to help them feel more comfortable making what's on the inside match what the world sees. Sex and gender are related to gender identity and are not the same thing as sexual preference or sexual orientation. This isn't a human sexuality class, so I'll leave it at that. But suffice it to say that one's gender identity is not necessarily related to their sexual preference. So the gender that I identify with as male or female may or may not be related to who I'm sexually attracted to. And the spectrum of sexuality is an entirely different conversation than that of gender identity. Moving along, gender roles are behaviors which tend to accompany stereotypical and social views of maleness and femaleness. So things like how girls wear dresses and play with dolls and are emotional, while boys wear blue and play with trucks and have to be tough, stereotypical ideals. There are a number of biological and social influences on gender, including how we think about and express our gender. These differences are evident in early infancy, suggesting that there may be some biological underpinnings present. As early as about 1 year of age, boys and girls tend to prefer to play with gender-specific toys. Non-human primates have also developed differences in preference for toys. Girls may prefer toys that elicit nurturing behaviors, like dolls and toy kitchens, while boys prefer toys that elicit more aggressive or dominant behaviors. Socialization has a major role in gender development, and parents often encourage gender stereotyped behaviors, whether on purpose or by accident. They tend to discourage boys from crying or encourage their girls to be nice and sweet. When you find out someone's pregnant, what's the first thing that they typically get asked? Oh, is it a boy or a girl? And the reason that we ask that question is so we know if we should buy them soft, pink, fluffy things or blue, active toys. And so we have a tendency to push gendered behaviors on children from very, very early on, which might help to explain why children display those gender-specific preferences from such an early age. Shifting gears now to adolescence, one of the major challenges or developmental tasks of adolescence is the formation of an identity, who we are, our goals or priorities, what defines us. Erik Erikson developed a comprehensive model to explain identity development and the crisis that we go through while we're figuring it out. Erikson's theory of identity development coined the term identity crisis to describe the confusion that adolescents often experience regarding their sense of self. Unlike Freud, who thought that personality development stopped after childhood, and we'll talk more about Freud when we get to the week on personality, Erikson believed that personality continued to develop across the lifespan, and he formulated an 8-stage model of human development. Erikson proposed that at each stage we confront a different psychosocial crisis, which is a dilemma concerning an individual's relation to other people in society. So in each stage, you have this conflict relating to your idea of self, your relationship to other people and the world around you, and how confident and capable you are. The main idea is that if you don't successfully pass through the earlier stages, you might struggle later on. I'm going to show you this video, which does a pretty good job.
Erikson's theory of psychosocial development identifies 8 stages which a healthy individual should pass through from birth to death. At each stage, we encounter different needs, ask new questions, and meet people who influence our behavior and learning. Stage 1. Basic trust versus mistrust. As infants, we ask ourselves if we can trust the world, and we wonder if it's safe. We learn that if we can trust someone now, we can also trust others in the future. If we experience fear, we develop doubt and mistrust. The key to our development is our mother. Stage 2. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. In our early childhood, we experience ourselves and discover our body. We ask, is it okay to be me? If we are allowed to discover ourselves, then we develop self-confidence. If we are not, we can develop shame and self-doubt. Both parents now play a major role. Stage 3. Initiative versus guilt. In preschool, we take initiative, try out new things, and learn basic principles like how round things roll. We ask, is it okay for me to do what I do? If we are encouraged, we can follow our interests. If we are held back or told that what we do is silly, we can develop guilt. We are now learning from the entire family. Stage 4. Industry versus inferiority. Now we discover our own interests and realize that we are different from others. We want to show that we can do things right. We ask if we can make it in this world. If we receive recognition from our teachers or peers, we become industrious, which is another word for hardworking. If we get too much negative feedback, we start to feel inferior and lose motivation. Our neighbors and schools now influence us the most. Stage 5. Identity versus role confusion. During adolescence, we learn that we have different social roles. We are friends, students, children, and citizens. Many experience an identity crisis. If our parents now allow us to go out and explore, we can find identity. If they push us to conform to their views, we can face role confusion and feel lost. Key to our learning are our peers and role models. Stage 6. Intimacy versus isolation. As young adults, we slowly understand who we are, and we start to let go of the relationships we had built earlier in order to fit in. We ask ourselves if we can love. If we can make a long-term commitment, we are confident and happy. If we cannot form intimate relationships, we might end up feeling isolated and lonely. Our friends and partners are now central to our development. Stage 7. Generativity versus stagnation. When we reach our 40s, we become comfortable, use our leisure time creatively, and maybe begin contributing to society. Our concern is generativity. If we think that we are able to lead the next generation into this world, we are happy. If we did not resolve some conflicts earlier, we can become pessimistic and experience stagnation. People at home and at work are now who influences the most. Stage 8. Ego integrity versus despair. As we grow older, we tend to slow down and begin to look back over our lives. We ask, how have I done? If we think we did well, we develop feelings of contentment and integrity. If not, we can experience despair and become grumpy and bitter. Time to compare us with mankind. Erik Erikson was a German-American psychologist who, together with his wife Joan, became known for his work on psychosocial development. He was influenced by Sigmund and Anna Freud and became famous for coining the phrase identity crisis. Although Erikson lacked even a bachelor's degree, he served as a professor at Harvard and Yale.
So here I have another video about Erikson's stages. It's Disney Pixar characters going through the different stages. I won't play this. It's kind of fun. So if you want to check it out on your own, I would suggest you do that. So throughout this lecture, we've talked about several different types of development: cognitive, social, personality. What about moral development? How do we develop a sense of morality and right and wrong? This sense begins to develop as early as preschool, but moral dilemmas emerge more frequently in our teen and adult years than in childhood. Lawrence Kohlberg was a major figure in the study of moral development, and he extended some of Piaget's thinking to identify how morality unfolds over time. So he explored this by determining how individuals deal with dilemmas. Kohlberg was less interested in the right and wrong answers, instead focusing on the reasoning individuals use to solve moral problems. So in one of his studies, he posed a scenario that you've probably heard of if you've ever taken an ethics class. A man has a sick wife and there's a new drug that the doctors think will help her, but the drug is so expensive he simply can't afford it. So the question becomes, should he steal the drug? And based on how people think through their answer, Kohlberg developed 3 major stages of moral development. First up is the pre-conventional stage, where people focus on punishment and reward of the situation. The conventional stage focuses on societal values. So what are the laws? Will he get arrested? The idea that it's illegal to steal regardless of the circumstances. And then there's post-conventional, which is where we focus on internal moral principles that transcend society. So, well, he should steal because the protection of human life is a higher moral principle that can overrule laws about stealing, or he shouldn't steal because doing so would violate a basic social contract needed to preserve civilization. So you see these stages sort of advance in their sophistication. And so we move from a pre-conventional stage through conventional to post-conventional. Changes in adulthood tend to be associated with major transitions in lifestyle or social status, and these can be both wonderful and stressful experiences. There's a lot of changes that occur related to careers. So it was once pretty normal for someone to work in one company or career for their entire lives, but today the average American changes jobs many times. Any idea how many? The average American changes job 10 and a half times between the ages of 10 and 40. So there's quite a bit of stress and fluctuation and stability going on there. Romantic relationships also require a major shift in lifestyle, but there's benefits to sharing life with a significant other. Physical and emotional intimacy are associated with greater physical health and reduced stress. Another major lifestyle change that happens in adulthood is parenting. Having a child of your own represents a massive, massive upheaval to your lifestyle. It can be both anxiety provoking, but also immensely rewarding. There's huge changes in schedule, reductions in sleep, challenges about balancing work and family, and ultimately, new parents tend to struggle the most when their expectations about the amount of change that are involved with having a new child are unrealistic. So it's important to be informed and recognize the reality of the situation. And then later on, there's some changes that occur in midlife. Probably the most well-known is the idea of the midlife crisis, or the supposed phase of adulthood characterized by emotional distress about the aging process and an attempt to regain youth. Most evidence, however, suggests that your stereotypical midlife crisis is more of a myth than a reality. We don't often see the middle-aged guy breaking down, quitting his job, buying the red sports car. That's more of a stereotype than reality. Then there's empty nest syndrome, which is a period of change and alleged depression in mothers following the departure of their grown children from the home. But there's not a ton of empirical evidence for this effect. It tends to be much more anecdotal in nature. There's also some transitions that occur later in life. So the average life expectancy in America is 75 for men and 80 for women. The elderly are the fastest growing population, and there's a lot of changes that occur at this stage of life. Although it seems like chronological age would make the most sense in terms of predicting outcome, there's a few other alternatives that may actually be more accurate. So if you remember, we talked earlier about chronological age. This is the most basic. So how old are you in years? How many years have you been on this earth? But we can also look at biological age, which is the estimate of a person's age in terms of their body's biological functioning. Some older people are in great physical shape and can put us all to shame in terms of the amount of exercise that they get and are able to do, whereas other older people are much more delicate and fragile and have a harder time moving around. There's psychological age, which is a person's mental attitudes and agility, their capacity to cope with the stresses of an ever-changing environment. And then there's functional age, which is the ability to function in their given role in society, to still work or take care of themselves if they live alone. And then there's social age, which is a person's behavior in relation to their own expectations for their age. And this picture here, that's me in the middle at my bridal shower with both of my grandmoms on either side. And they represent a really good example, actually, of different ways that you can think about age. So chronologically, they're the same age. Their birthdays are actually only a couple days apart. But my mom, Barbara, on the left in the red jacket, is much more physically frail. She now requires a walker to get around. She has a harder time moving. Whereas my mom, Joan, on the right, this woman could run laps around all of us without breaking a sweat. She's in phenomenal physical shape. She still sits on the floor to hang out with the grandkids, walks 5 miles a day to the casino because she lives in Atlantic City. The two of them represent a really great example of how two people who are the same chronological age might show different differences in other capacities of aging. And so that's all I have for this week on development. Next week, I believe we will talk about emotion and motivation. So I will see you then.